Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. My father, Thomas, had always been a man of few words, the kind who preferred the solitude of long-haul trucking routes to the complications of human conversation. After the divorce 3 years ago, our relationship had withered into occasional phone calls and awkward holiday visits. When he called that Tuesday evening in March 2022, suggesting we take a camping trip to the remote Carrizo Mountains, I was surprised. The hesitation in his voice, the way he stumbled over the invitation, told me this meant more to him than he was letting on. "I know a spot," he said, his weathered voice crackling through the phone connection. "Been wanting to go back there for years. Quiet place. Good for thinking." I agreed, despite my reservations. Maybe this was his way of trying to rebuild what we'd lost. Maybe mine too. Thomas picked me up the following Saturday in his aging Ford pickup Scout, his loyal border collie mix panting eagerly in the truck bed. The drive took us deep into the high desert country, where cell towers became sparse and the last gas station sat 50 miles behind us. The landscape grew increasingly desolate as we climbed winding dirt roads that seemed to lead nowhere. "Used to drive through here on runs to Phoenix," Thomas explained, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Always wondered about the old mining trails up in these ridges." The sun was beginning its descent when we finally reached our destination. A narrow canyon flanked by towering red rock walls that seemed to close in around us like grasping fingers. The silence was complete, oppressive even, broken only by the distant call of a solitary hawk circling overhead. We established our campsite in a small clearing beside a dry creek bed, the ground hard-packed and littered with smooth river stones that spoke of flash floods in seasons past. Thomas moved with practiced efficiency, but I noticed how his eyes kept darting to the canyon walls above us, scanning the rocky ledges as if expecting to see something looking back. Scout bounded around the campsite, nose to the ground, but even the dog seemed unsettled. His usual playful energy was subdued, and he stayed close to the truck, whining softly whenever the wind whistled through the canyon walls. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped dramatically. We built a fire from dead juniper branches, the flames casting dancing shadows against the rock walls that surrounded us. The shadows seemed to move independently, creating shapes that my tired mind struggled to interpret. Every crack of settling wood in the fire made me jump. "Beautiful place," I said, trying to break the tension that had settled over us like a heavy blanket. Thomas nodded slowly, poking at the fire with a stick. "Beautiful. Yeah. But there's something about this canyon that's always bothered me." He paused, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. "Last time I was near here, maybe 15 years back, I had a breakdown on the main road, had to walk 5 miles for help. Kept feeling like something was following me the whole way." "Following you?" Footsteps behind me on the gravel. Every time I'd stop and look back, nothing there. But the footsteps would stop too, like whatever it was knew I was listening. He shook his head. Probably just my imagination, being alone out here for too long. But I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe it was imagination. We ate dinner in relative quiet, canned beans and hot dogs cooked over the open flame. The food tasted like ash in my mouth, though I couldn't explain why. Every sound seemed amplified in the canyon, the pop of sap in the burning wood, the distant howl of coyotes somewhere in the darkness beyond our circle of light, the scrape of our forks against the metal camping plates. It was Scout who first alerted us that something was wrong. Around 10 o'clock, the dog suddenly lifted his head from where he'd been lying by the fire, ears pricked forward, a low growl rumbling in his throat. His entire body went rigid, focused on something beyond the firelight. "What is it, boy?" Thomas asked quietly, reaching for the flashlight beside his camping chair. Scout's growl intensified, his lips pulling back to reveal his teeth. Then, without warning, he bolted into the darkness, barking furiously. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, multiplying until it seemed like a pack of dogs surrounded us. "Scout," I called, jumping to my feet. "Scout, come back." Thomas grabbed my arm. "Don't go after him. Not in the dark." We stood at the edge of our firelight, listening as Scout's barking grew more frantic, then suddenly cut off. The silence that followed was absolute. suffocating. Even the coyotes had gone quiet. "We should look for him," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "In the morning," Thomas replied firmly, "soon as there's light." But I could see the worry etched deep in the lines of his face. Scout had been his constant companion for 8 years. The dog never ran off, never disobeyed commands. Something had spooked him badly enough to abandon everything he'd been trained to do. Neither of us slept well that night. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the canvas roof of our tent, listening to every sound outside. Thomas tossed and turned beside me, occasionally muttering Scout's name in his fitful dreams. Around 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, circling our campsite just beyond the dying embers of our fire. The crunch of gravel under heavy boots, the soft scrape of something being dragged. I held my breath, straining to hear more clearly. The footsteps stopped directly outside our tent. I could hear breathing, deep, labored, like someone who had been running for a long time. But there was something wrong with the rhythm, something that made my skin crawl. It was too slow, too controlled, like someone forcing themselves to breathe normally when every instinct told them to pant. I reached over and shook Thomas awake. He came to consciousness immediately, alert in the way that years of highway driving had trained him to be. I pressed my finger to my lips and pointed toward the tent wall. We lay there in the darkness, listening. The breathing continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then, slowly, the footsteps resumed, moving away from our tent toward the creek bed. Thomas whispered in my ear, his breath hot and urgent. "Stay here. Don't move until morning." But staying still was torture. My muscles cramped from the tension, my mind racing with possibilities. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere? How had they found our remote campsite? And where was Scout? First light couldn't come soon enough. As soon as there was enough visibility to see beyond the tent, Thomas and I emerged to assess our situation. The fire had burned down to cold ashes, and frost covered everything with a thin crystalline coating that crunched under our boots. What we found around our campsite made my stomach lurch. There were footprints in the soft sand near the creek bed, large boot prints that circled our camp in a complete loop. But these weren't the prints of a casual hiker. They showed signs of someone moving carefully, deliberately, placing each step with precision. In several places the prints stopped and showed evidence of the person crouching down, as if they had been watching us for extended periods. More disturbing were the other marks we found. Near the fire pit, scratched into the dirt with what looked like a stick or knife blade, was a crude drawing. It showed 2 figures lying in what was clearly meant to be a tent, with a third figure standing over them. The level of detail was unsettling. Whoever had drawn this had been watching us sleep. "We need to find Scout and get out of here," Thomas said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Right now." But as we gathered our gear, I noticed something that made my hands shake so badly I could barely grip my backpack. Thomas's truck, parked 20 yards away, had been tampered with. The hood was slightly ajar, and when we went to investigate, we found that several engine components had been deliberately loosened, not damaged, but sabotaged in a way that would cause the engine to fail after a few miles of driving. We were stranded, and whoever had done this wanted us to know it. Finding Scout became our primary objective, but I suspected Thomas had another motive. He needed something to focus on besides our increasingly desperate situation. We packed light, taking only water, energy bars, and the hunting knife Thomas always carried. The canyon system was more complex than it had appeared in the darkness. Narrow side passages branched off in multiple directions, some barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The walls rose 60 feet or more on either side, creating a maze of shadows and dead ends. We followed what might have been dog tracks through the sand, though it was difficult to tell Scout's prints from the numerous coyote sign that crisscrossed the area. The tracks led us deeper into the canyon system, where the walls closed in and the sky above became a narrow ribbon of blue. It was in one of these narrow passages that we found the first evidence of Scout's fate. Tufts of his distinctive black and white fur were caught on the thorns of a scrub oak growing from a crack in the rock wall. But it wasn't just a few loose hairs. There was too much of it, torn out in chunks as if he had been dragged past the tree while struggling violently. "Scout," Thomas called, his voice echoing off the walls. "Scout boy, where are you?" The echo came back distorted, multiplied, until it sounded like a dozen voices calling the dog's name, but there was no answering bark, no sound of paws scrambling over rock. Instead, from somewhere deeper in the canyon system, we heard something that made us both freeze in terror. It was Scout's bark, but wrong. The pitch was too high, the rhythm too regular, like someone imitating the sound without understanding its natural pattern, and it was coming from at least 3 different directions at once. "That's not Scout," Thomas whispered, grabbing my arm. "We need to go back, now." But as we turned to retrace our steps, we discovered that the passage behind us was blocked. A pile of rocks and debris had been stacked across the narrow opening, clearly placed there deliberately while we were searching ahead. The barrier was too high and unstable to climb, and too heavy to move quickly. We were trapped in a dead-end passage barely 10 feet wide. The fake barking continued from the canyon walls above us, sometimes sounding like it was coming from directly overhead. I pressed myself against the rock wall, craning my neck to look up. But the passages were too narrow and the walls too high to see anything clearly. "What does he want?" I asked, my voice cracking with fear. Thomas was examining the rockfall behind us, testing individual stones to see if we could create an opening.
"I don't know,"
he said grimly, "but people don't do this kind of thing unless they're planning something worse." That's when we heard the voice. It came from somewhere above us, echoing down between the canyon walls. Distorted but unmistakably human. "Thomas? I know you're down there, Thomas." My father went rigid, the color draining from his face. "How does he know my name?" The voice continued, casual and conversational, like someone chatting over a fence. "Brought your boy with you this time, didn't you? Good. Been waiting for you to come back, Thomas. Been waiting a long time." The implication hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't random. Whoever was stalking us had specifically been waiting for my father to return. The sabotage, the surveillance, the careful herding of us into this dead-end passage. It was all planned. "We need to get out of here," I whispered urgently. But even as I said it, I could hear sounds from above. The scrape of boots on rock, the clatter of loose stones being deliberately kicked down into our passage. Our stalker was positioning himself directly overhead, where he could watch our every move. The next few hours tested every survival instinct we possessed. Using the hunting knife and our bare hands, we began the painstaking process of dismantling the rockfall that blocked our escape route. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Several times, larger stones shifted unexpectedly, nearly crushing our hands and feet. All the while, the voice continued its monologue from above, sometimes taunting, sometimes eerily friendly. He told us about watching our campsite the night before, about how peaceful we looked sleeping. He described details about our truck, our gear, even the contents of our backpacks, proving that he had thoroughly searched our belongings while we slept. Most chilling of all, he talked about Scout. "Your dog put up quite a fight," the voice said conversationally. "Brave little thing. Don't worry though, he's not suffering anymore." Thomas's hands stilled on the rocks for a moment, his shoulders shaking with grief and rage. Then he redoubled his efforts, tearing at the stones with bleeding fingers. As the sun reached its zenith and began its descent toward the canyon rim, we finally created an opening large enough to squeeze through. Thomas went first, then helped pull me through the gap. My clothes were torn, my arms scraped raw from the rough stone, but we were free of the trap. Behind us, we could hear our stalker scrambling down from his perch, cursing as he realized we had escaped. His footsteps echoed through the canyon passages, sometimes seeming to come from one direction, sometimes another, as he searched for us. We ran. Through the maze of passages, over loose rock and around blind corners, we ran with the desperate energy of prey animals. My lungs burned in the thin mountain air. My legs shook with exhaustion, but terror drove us forward. When we finally emerged into the main canyon where our truck waited, the sun was setting, painting the rock walls blood red. To our amazement, the truck started immediately. Thomas quickly discovered that our saboteur had only loosened the connections, not destroyed them. Perhaps he had wanted us mobile but unreliable, controllable. We didn't stop to investigate further. With Scout's lifeless body carefully wrapped in a camping blanket and placed in the truck bed, we drove through the night, not speaking, not stopping, until we reached the safety of the main highway and the distant lights of civilization. I never learned who our stalker was, or why he had been waiting specifically for my father to return to that remote canyon. Thomas refused to discuss it further, and I respected his silence. Some experiences are too raw, too personal to dissect with words. What I do know is that the trip accomplished what my father had hoped for, though not in the way either of us expected. Shared terror has a way of stripping away pretense, of revealing what truly matters. In those desperate hours fighting for our survival, we rediscovered the bond that divorce and distance had obscured. Thomas never went back to that canyon, and neither did I. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, I find myself wondering if our stalker is still there, waiting patiently in the shadows between the red rock walls, calling out names that echo off into the emptiness, waiting for the next travelers foolish enough to seek solitude in a place where solitude itself has become predator. The wilderness is vast and indifferent, but the humans who disappear into its depths are not always seeking the same kind of peace that drives the rest of us to those remote places. Some are hunting for something far more dangerous than deer or elk. They're hunting for us. Almost 13 years have passed since that week in Montana, but the memories remain as vivid as though they happened yesterday. Before my husband and I settled into our comfortable suburban life, before children and mortgages and grocery lists, I was someone who craved adventure. I'd grown up riding horses at my aunt's farm every summer, spending countless hours in the saddle, learning to read a horse's mood through the tension in their muscles, the flick of their ears. By the time I turned 27 in the spring of 2012, I'd been dreaming of a real cattle drive for years. Not the sanitized tourist version, but something authentic, challenging, raw. I found what I was looking for through a ranch operation in southern Montana. They advertised a 5-day horse drive that promised the complete cowboy experience. The price was steep, but I'd been saving for 2 years. When I finally clicked the booking button, my hands were shaking with anticipation. The flight to Billings was smooth, though I barely noticed the scenery below. My mind was already out on the open range, wind in my face, hooves thundering beneath me. At the airport, I found the other guest riders gathered near baggage claim, a diverse group that included a couple from Germany, 2 women from somewhere in the United Kingdom, a man from France, and 3 other Americans besides myself. Our driver, a weathered man in his 60s named Hugh, loaded our bags into a van with practiced efficiency. The drive to the ranch took 2.5 hours, winding through landscape that grew increasingly remote. As we left the highway behind, the road became gravel, then dirt. Cell phone signals died. The last town we passed through was barely more than a gas station and a post office. After that, there was nothing but empty land stretching to the horizon in every direction. During the drive, we shared our backgrounds. The German couple, whom I'll call Jürgen and Helga, had traveled extensively but had never done anything like this. The British women, Louise and Catherine, were experienced riders who'd participated in similar drives in Australia. The Frenchman, Philippe, admitted he was somewhat terrified, but didn't want to die without trying something that scared him. The other Americans, a father and son from Ohio named Gregory and Tom, and a woman from California I'll call Amanda, all had various levels of riding experience. As we talked and laughed, trying to ease our nervous excitement, I noticed Hugh watching us in the rearview mirror. His expression was difficult to read, but there was something in his eyes that made me uneasy. Not hostile exactly, but assessing, like he was measuring whether we'd make it through what lay ahead. The ranch appeared as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the weathered buildings. It looked like something from another century. A main house with a wraparound porch, several outbuildings with peeling paint, and beyond them, the stables and corrals. The place had a lived-in quality, authentic in a way that made my heart race with excitement. This was real. This wasn't some dude ranch with Wi-Fi and hot tubs. A woman named Jane, the ranch cook, fed us a dinner of beef stew and cornbread, while our guide, a man named Russell, explained the plan. We'd spend the first full day on shorter rides, getting used to our horses and learning to work as a group. The second day would involve locating the herd, approximately 150 horses that roamed the plains north of the ranch. Then we'd spend 3 days driving them south to their summer grazing land in Wyoming, camping on the open range at night. "This isn't a vacation," Russell said, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes and wind. This is work. Real work. The horses don't care that you paid to be here. The land doesn't care. If you can't keep up, you'll stay behind with Jane. No shame in that, but be honest with yourselves about what you can handle. His words should have comforted me. He was being straightforward, setting clear expectations. Instead, they made my stomach clench with anxiety. What if I couldn't keep up? What if I'd overestimated my abilities? That night, lying in the small bunkhouse room, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling around me. Horses moved in their stalls, restless. Something, maybe a coyote, howled in the distance. The wind scraped tree branches against the side of the building with a sound like fingernails on wood. I woke at 4:30 to the smell of coffee and bacon. My body ached already, anticipating the hours I'd spend in the saddle. But when I walked down to the stables after breakfast and saw the horses waiting in the dawn light, all my doubts evaporated. My horse was a Mustang mare with a caramel-colored coat and a black mane. Her spots reminded me of Cookies, so I learned her name was Chip. She regarded me with intelligent brown eyes, and when I approached, she didn't shy away. I ran my hand along her neck, feeling the warmth of her, the solid muscle beneath her coat. In that moment, I felt a connection that's difficult to explain to non-riders, a sense of partnership, of mutual trust that would have to develop between us. The first ride was everything I'd hoped for. We headed east as the sun rose, turning the plains golden. The landscape was more varied than I'd expected. Not flat, but rolling, with hidden draws and sudden ridges. Russell led us at a steady pace, occasionally calling out instructions. The wranglers rode alongside us, their posture relaxed, at home in a way I envied. By the time we returned to the ranch that evening, I was exhausted but exhilarated. My legs trembled as I dismounted. My back ached, but I'd never felt more alive. The second day began even earlier. We were in the saddle by 5, riding north under a sky still scattered with stars. The temperature was cold enough that I could see my breath and chips forming clouds in the air. As the sun rose, the landscape revealed itself in shades of brown and gold and green, vast and empty in a way that made me feel simultaneously insignificant and free. We rode for over an hour across terrain that seemed featureless, following Russell and the wranglers who navigated by landmarks invisible to me, a particular rock formation, a distant ridge, the way a creek bed curved. Then finally we crested a low hill, and there they were. The sight stopped my breath. More than 150 horses spread across the valley below us, their coats every shade from deep bay to palomino to pure white. They grazed peacefully, unaware of us watching from above. Russell explained they were descended from Spanish horses that had escaped from settlements in the 1600s, wild animals that had never been broken, living free across this land for generations. Your job, Russell said, is to push them south without scattering them. Stay in your positions. Don't crowd them, but don't let them break away. They're smart, and they'll test you. If you see one trying to split from the group, you ride to head it off. Questions? We had dozens, but there was no time. The wranglers were already moving down the hill, spreading out to begin the drive. We followed, and suddenly we were in the middle of it, surrounded by moving horses, dust rising, hooves drumming the earth. One of the wranglers, a man named Cole, rode past me shouting instructions I could barely hear over the noise. When a young colt tried to break left, running straight toward my position, instinct took over. I urged Chip forward, cutting the colt off, turning it back toward the herd. Cole gave me a sharp nod of approval. The work was harder than anything I'd imagined. The wranglers rode like they were angry, aggressive, loud, pushing the herd relentlessly. They cursed constantly, at the horses, at each other, at us, when we made mistakes. When I drifted out of position, letting a gap open where several horses tried to escape, Cole rode up beside me and unleashed a stream of profanity that made my face burn with shame. But I corrected my position, closed the gap, and kept going. We drove the horses all day, stopping only briefly for lunch and water. By the time the ranch came back into view in late afternoon, every muscle in my body screamed with exhaustion. My hands were blistered from the reins. My throat was raw from dust. But we'd done it. We'd moved the herd. That night at dinner, the wrangler's assessment of us was brutally honest. We'd made mistakes, lots of them, but we'd learned. Tomorrow would be harder. Russell warned. Tomorrow we'd start the real drive. and we wouldn't have the luxury of returning to the ranch each night. Get as much rest as you can, he said. We're riding at 4:30, and the next few nights we'll be on the ground. Bring everything you need, because once we're out there until the job is done. I tried to sleep but couldn't. My mind raced with excitement and nervousness. Finally, around 10, exhaustion overtook me. The wake-up call came at 4:30, just as Russell had promised. My body protested every movement as I dressed in the dark. The bunkhouse was filled with the sounds of others doing the same. Groans, muttered complaints, the rustling of clothing. Outside, the air was frigid. Stars still filled the sky, though the eastern horizon showed the first hints of coming dawn. Coffee helped, strong and bitter, and breakfast was substantial. Eggs, bacon, toast, oatmeal. Jane loaded us up like we were heading to war. In a sense, I suppose we were. A war against exhaustion, against inexperience, against the wild nature of the horses we'd be driving. We found the herd easily. They hadn't moved far from where we'd left them the previous evening. The drive began smoothly enough. We fell into formation more naturally today, anticipating the horses' movements, working together with increasing confidence. When a particularly stubborn young stallion tried repeatedly to break away, I helped turn him back 3 times, and by the third I was grinning despite my fatigue. We drove them through the ranch property in a long arc, then continued south. The landscape changed as we went, becoming rougher, with more rocks and scrub brush. The sun climbed higher, turning the day hot after the cold morning. Sweat soaked through my shirt. Chip's coat darkened with exertion. Late in the afternoon, we reached our campsite, a relatively flat area near a small creek, with some sparse trees providing minimal shade. The wranglers showed us how to set up the high line for the horses, a rope stretched between 2 trees where we could tie them for the night. We erected our tents in a rough circle around where the campfire would be. As the sun set and temperatures dropped, we gathered around the fire. Jane had packed food that we heated in cast-iron skillets, beans, strips of beef, bread. It was simple but tasted incredible after the day's work. We talked about the ride, comparing notes, sharing our mistakes and small victories. Gradually, as darkness fell complete and the fire burned down to glowing coals, people began drifting toward their tents. I should have been exhausted enough to fall asleep immediately. But sitting there watching the flames, listening to the horses shifting and snorting behind us, feeling the vast emptiness of the wilderness around us, I couldn't bring myself to close my eyes and miss a moment of it. One of the wranglers, a younger man named Troy, remained by the fire as well. We talked about nothing important. Favorite foods, bad movies, the best brands of beef jerky. Then something flew over my head. I heard it more than saw it. A rushing sound, like air being displaced. It landed a few feet from the fire with a wet thump that didn't sound right. I screamed before I could stop myself, a sharp cry that shattered the peaceful night. Immediately, tent zippers ripped open. Flashlights clicked on. People emerged, asking what happened, voices tight with concern and confusion. We all converged on the spot near the fire, and as the flashlight beams illuminated what lay there, I felt my stomach turn over. It was the back half of a jackrabbit torn roughly through the middle, the separation jagged and violent. The legs were still intact, the tail, but the rest was simply gone. Blood soaked into the dirt around it, dark and wet. In the harsh light of the flashlights, I could see where the spine had been separated, white bone visible among red tissue. "What the hell?" someone said. Philippe, I think, his French accent thick with shock. Russell and the other wranglers pushed through to examine it. Russell crouched down, studying the carcass without touching it. His face was unreadable in the shifting light. "Could be a bird," one of the wranglers suggested. "Hawk or eagle, maybe. Could have dropped it flying over." But Troy was shaking his head. "Did you see the way it came in? It didn't fall. It came at an angle, like someone threw it." The words hung in the air. Around the circle, people shifted uneasily. I looked out into the darkness beyond our firelight, suddenly aware of how exposed we were, how vulnerable. There was nothing out there, no lights, no buildings, no help. Just emptiness and darkness and whatever might be watching us from within it. Russell stood, wiping his hands on his jeans though he hadn't touched anything. "All right, listen up. Could be some kid from Fort Smith trying to spook us. Town's not that far, and there's always some joker who thinks scaring tourists is funny. Me and the boys are going to ride out, make sure the area is clear. You all stay put. Keep the fire going. Stay together. They saddled up quickly, taking flashlights, and I noticed rifles from their saddlebags. Then they rode out in different directions, their lights bobbing away into the darkness. We waited huddled together, nobody speaking. The horses seemed unsettled, moving restlessly against their lines. The fire crackled and every sound made me jump. They were gone for almost an hour. When they returned, Russell's expression was grim. Didn't find anything. No tracks, no signs of anyone. But that doesn't mean much. Ground's hard here, and someone who knows what they're doing could cover their tracks easy enough. He looked at each of us in turn. Tomorrow we're moving to a different campsite, about 20 miles south. We're all armed, and we'll be keeping watch through the night. Whatever this was, prank or animal or accident, you're safe. Understand? We nodded, but I don't think any of us truly believed it. We returned to our tents. But I doubt anyone slept well. I certainly didn't. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to every sound, imagining figures moving in the darkness outside, wondering what kind of person would throw a torn animal into a camp in the middle of nowhere, and why. Morning came as a relief. Something about daylight made everything seem less threatening, but the mood among our group had shifted. The excited chatter of previous mornings was replaced by quiet conversation and nervous glances. We broke camp efficiently, loaded our gear, and were back in the saddle by 6. The drive that morning required all my concentration. The horses seemed more skittish than before, as if they too had sensed something wrong during the night. Several times individuals tried to break away, forcing us to ride hard to turn them back. Russell pushed us to maintain a faster pace than the previous day, clearly wanting to put distance between us and last night's campsite. We crossed a river in early afternoon. Not deep, but swift-moving and cold. Chip balked at first, but I urged her forward, trusting her instincts. The water came up to her chest, soaking my boots and jeans, shockingly cold, even though the air temperature was warm. On the far side, we paused to let the horses drink and to eat lunch ourselves. Jürgen, the German man, approached me as I sat on a sun-warmed rock, eating a sandwich. His English was excellent, his manner friendly, despite the tension hanging over us all. "What do you think happened last night?" he asked. Truly, I didn't know how to answer. In daylight, with the sun warm on my face and the river babbling nearby, it was tempting to dismiss the incident as Russell had suggested some local prankster with too much time and not enough sense. But I couldn't shake the memory of how that object had flown through the air, the deliberate arc of it, or the careful precision of how the rabbit had been torn. "I don't know," I said finally, "but I'm glad we moved camps." He nodded, looking out across the river we'd just crossed. In Germany, we have stories about the wilderness, about things that live in remote places. My grandmother used to tell them, but I never believed them. I thought they were just, how do you say, folklore, to scare children. He paused. Now I think maybe there is truth in old stories, not about monsters, but about the fact that some places don't want us there. His words gave me chills despite the warm sun. Before I could respond, Russell called out that it was time to ride. We mounted up and continued south. By late afternoon, we'd covered the 20 miles Russell had promised. The new campsite was more exposed than the first, fewer trees, but better visibility in all directions. As we set up camp, I noticed the wranglers positioning themselves strategically around the perimeter. Russell had divided the night into shifts, ensuring someone would always be awake and watching. Dinner was quieter than the previous night. We were all exhausted from the long day's ride. Yes, but there was more to it than that. The rabbit incident had cast a shadow over the group. People kept glancing toward the darkness beyond our fire, starting at every sound. As full darkness fell, Russell addressed us one final time before we turned in. "I know last night spooked you. Hell, it spooked us too. But we've got 20 more miles to cover tomorrow, and then one more day after that to reach the Wyoming border. You came here for an authentic experience. And this is it. The real thing. The good and the bad. The wilderness doesn't care about our comfort or our fears. It just is. So get some rest. Trust that we're keeping watch. And tomorrow we finish this thing. Understood." We murmured our agreement and headed for our tents. I crawled into my sleeping bag fully clothed, my boots nearby in case I needed to move fast. Outside, I could hear Troy settling in for the first watch shift. The horses made their usual sounds. Snorts, the stamping of hooves, the occasional whinny. Normal sounds. Comforting sounds. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew I was jerking awake to the sound of Troy shouting, "Who's out there? Show yourself!" My heart hammered against my ribs. I sat up, fumbling for my flashlight. Around me I heard the others stirring, voices asking what was happening. The horses had gone quiet, eerily so, as if they were holding their breath. Then they exploded into sound. It started as nervous shifting, hooves scraping the ground. Then it became more agitated, snorting, whinnying, the sound of bodies pulling against the high line. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline. By the time I got my tent unzipped and crawled outside, the horses were in full panic. I emerged from my tent into chaos. The horses were screaming. There's no other word for it. Not normal horse sounds, but high-pitched, terrified shrieks that cut through the night like knives. The high line was shaking violently as they pulled against it. In the darkness, illuminated only by our flashlights and the dying campfire, I could see their eyes rolling white with panic. Russell and another wrangler whose name I'd never learned burst from their tent. The second man already raising his flashlight to scan the darkness where the horses were looking. Troy stood near the fire, his own light pointed outward, his other hand on the rifle at his side. "What is it?" someone called. "Amanda, I think," her voice high with fear. "Don't know," Troy called back. "Something's got them spooked bad." The understatement of the century. Chip was among those horses, and even from a distance I could see her straining against her line, her muscles bunched, ready to bolt. The other horses were the same. Every animal on that line was preparing to run. "We need to," Russell started to say, but he never finished. The high line snapped. I'd never thought about how much force terrified horses could generate when they pulled together. The rope was thick, meant to hold, but against that much panic-driven strength, it gave way like thread. The sound was like a gunshot, and the second it broke, 18 horses were free. For one frozen moment, they milled in confusion, their instinct to run warring with uncertainty about which direction to go. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, they chose to run straight through our camp. Russell screamed something. A warning, an order. I couldn't tell. One of the wranglers ran forward, arms raised, trying to turn the herd. The horses didn't slow. The lead stallion, a massive bay, ran straight at the man. I saw him dive aside, but he wasn't fast enough. A hoof caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground where he lay stunned. Then the rest of the herd was upon us. I dove for my tent, but there was no safety there. The first horse hit my tent at full gallop, its hooves punching through the nylon like it was paper. I felt something, a leg maybe, strike my shoulder, sending me sprawling. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind from my lungs. Above me I saw the underside of a horse as it jumped my prone form, its hooves missing my head by inches. Around me the night filled with screams, human and equine both. Someone yelled, "Get down," and I pressed myself flat, covering my head with my arms as horse after horse thundered past. The ground shook with their passage. Dirt and rocks kicked up by their hooves rained down on me. The sound was overwhelming, pounding hooves, screaming people, the crashing of tents being trampled. Gregory, the father from Ohio, had emerged from his tent just as the stampede reached him. I watched in horror as a chestnut mare struck him with her shoulder, sending him flying backward into his son, and then both of them were on the ground with horses jumping over and around them. Tom's arm was bent at a wrong angle. Gregory wasn't moving. The British woman Louise tried to run, but running triggered something primal in the horses, a predator response maybe. 2 horses changed direction to avoid her, but a third didn't. It hit her from behind and she went down. The horse didn't fall, didn't even stumble. Its hooves came down again and again as it fought for balance, and each impact made a sound I'll never forget, heavy thuds accompanied by wet cracks. Amanda was struck by one of the metal clips from a broken lead rope, moving with the speed of a bullet. It caught her across the face, and I saw blood explode from her cheek. She spun and collapsed, hands clutching her face, her screams joining the chorus. The Frenchman, Philippe, managed to dive behind a pile of gear, but a horse's flank hit the pile, sending bags and equipment flying. One bag caught him in the head, and he dropped like someone had cut his strings. And through it all, the horses kept coming. Beautiful, gentle creatures transformed into instruments of destruction by their blind panic. They crashed through our campfire, scattering burning wood. They trampled tents, gear, food, anything in their path. The high line still attached to some of them whipped through the air like a lash, striking whoever was unlucky enough to be in its path. I lost track of time. The stampede might have lasted 30 seconds or 5 minutes, I honestly couldn't tell you. All I knew was the thunder of hooves, the screams, the impacts, the smell of horse sweat and fear and blood. And then finally it was over. The last horse disappeared into the darkness, and suddenly the night was quiet except for the groans of the injured. I lay on the ground for a long moment, unable to move, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. My shoulder throbbed where the horse had struck me. My lungs burned. Every breath seemed to scrape against my ribs. But I was alive, and as the shock began to fade, I realized I needed to get up, to help. I rolled over slowly, testing my limbs. Everything worked, though my shoulder protested sharply when I put weight on it. Around me, the camp was destroyed. Tents lay flattened or torn to shreds. Gear was scattered everywhere. The campfire had been reduced to smoldering embers and scattered wood, but several small fires had started where burning brands had been kicked into dry grass. Russell and Troy were already stamping these out, but it was the people who demanded attention. Groans and cries came from multiple directions. The wrangler who'd tried to turn the herd, I learned later his name was Peter, was sitting up, cradling his shoulder. His face was gray with pain, but he was mobile. Russell checked him quickly, determined nothing was broken but probably badly bruised or dislocated, and told him to stay put. Gregory and Tom, the father and son, were both down. Tom was conscious, crying, holding his arm which bent at a grotesque angle halfway between his elbow and wrist. Gregory was unconscious, a lump already forming on his forehead where he'd struck something, the ground, a rock, another person's boot, impossible to say. Russell checked his pulse and breathing, both present, and carefully turned him into a recovery position. Louise, the British woman who'd been trampled, was conscious but clearly in severe pain. She was trying not to move, tears streaming down her face. Her left leg was bent wrong, obviously broken. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, shock setting in. Catherine, her friend, knelt beside her, trying to comfort her while clearly fighting her own panic. Amanda was sitting up, blood running between the fingers pressed to her face. When she moved her hand, I could see a deep gash that ran from her cheekbone to her jawline. The metal clip had laid her face open. She was crying silently, her eyes wide with shock. Philippe, the Frenchman, was conscious but disoriented. He kept asking what happened in French, seeming unable to process the English responses. Blood ran from his hairline where the bag had struck him. And then there was Jürgen, the German man who'd asked me that afternoon what I thought about the rabbit incident. He was the worst. He lay on his back, his breathing wet and labored. When I reached him, I could see why. His chest was caved in on the left side, the ribs clearly broken, possibly driven into his lungs. His mouth was bloody, several teeth had been knocked out, and others were broken off at wrong angles. His left arm was bent at a compound fracture, bone visible through torn skin. His eyes were open but unfocused, his skin pale and clammy. "Don't move," I told him, though he didn't seem capable of movement anyway. "We're getting help." Russell was already on his satellite phone, calling for emergency assistance. Cell phones were useless out here, but the ranch had insisted all wranglers carry satellite phones for exactly this kind of emergency. His voice was calm but urgent as he described our situation and gave our coordinates. I heard him say multiple serious injuries and need immediate helicopter evacuation. The next hours were a nightmare of a different sort than the stampede. We did what we could with our limited medical supplies. The ranch had provided first aid kits, but they were designed for minor injuries, cuts, scrapes, maybe a twisted ankle. Nothing in them was adequate for broken bones, potential internal injuries, severe lacerations. We used torn clothing to bind Tom's broken arm. We kept Gregory in the recovery position and monitored his breathing. We tried to keep Louise's broken leg immobilized. We pressed clean cloth to Amanda's face, trying to slow the bleeding. Philippe we kept talking to, making sure he didn't lose consciousness. And Jürgen. For Jürgen, all we could do was try to keep him comfortable and breathing until real help arrived. Russell organized the wranglers who weren't injured to gather all the working flashlights and position them to create a makeshift landing zone for the helicopter. The nearest town with medical facilities was over an hour away by vehicle, but a helicopter could make it much faster. The helicopter arrived just as dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky. The sound of its rotors was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. It landed in a swirl of dust and wind, and 2 paramedics jumped out. They worked with incredible efficiency, assessing each injured person quickly. After a brief consultation with Russell, they determined that Jurgen needed to be evacuated immediately. His breathing was getting worse, and they were concerned about lung collapse and internal bleeding. They loaded him onto a stretcher and into the helicopter. Within minutes, they were lifting off, the sound fading as they raced toward the hospital. The rest of us would have to wait for ground transport. 4 vehicles arrived about 2 hours later. Ranch trucks and 1 van, all equipped to handle rough terrain. They loaded Gregory, Tom, Louise, Amanda, and Philippe carefully. The rest of us, those who were uninjured or had only minor injuries, would ride back separately. Before the vehicles left, Russell pulled me aside. His face was drawn, exhausted, and something else. Guilty, maybe, or angry. Probably both. "I need you to know," he said quietly, "that nothing like this has ever happened before. 23 years I've been running these drives. We've had accidents, someone falls off a horse, equipment breaks, someone gets sick. But this," he looked toward where the injured were being loaded. "This wasn't natural. Horses don't stampede like that for no reason. Something spooked them, deliberately." "The rabbit," I said. He nodded. The rabbit. Whatever threw that into our camp last night came back. And this time, they did something to those horses. I don't know what made a sound, threw something, I don't know. But this was intentional. The words hung between us, heavy with implication. Someone had done this. Someone had deliberately caused the stampede that had destroyed our camp and injured 8 people. "Why?" I asked. Russell's jaw tightened. "Because some people don't want outsiders here. They think the land belongs to them, that tourists are ruining something that should stay wild and empty. They're wrong, but that doesn't make them less dangerous." The vehicles departed, taking the injured to medical care. The rest of us were left in the destroyed camp, waiting for our own transport. The sun rose higher, warming the day, but I couldn't stop shivering. I kept seeing it replay in my mind, the horses bearing down, the people falling, the impacts, the blood. The ride back to the ranch was silent. We were crammed into the remaining vehicles, dirty, exhausted, traumatized. The landscape that had seemed so beautiful just days ago now felt hostile, threatening. Every shadow might conceal someone watching. Every distant ridge might hide whoever had caused this. At the ranch, Jane had hot food and coffee waiting. She took one look at us and didn't ask questions, just started serving. We ate mechanically, not tasting the food, just needing fuel. Russell was on the phone, coordinating with the hospital, dealing with insurance companies, fielding calls from worried family members who'd been contacted. Later that afternoon, we received updates. Jurgen was in surgery. Multiple broken ribs, collapsed lung, internal bleeding. They were optimistic but cautious. Gregory had a severe concussion but was expected to recover fully. Tom's arm required surgery to set properly. Louise's leg was badly broken and would need pins. Amanda's face would need careful stitching and would likely scar. Philippe had a concussion and was being kept for observation. The ranch offered everyone complete refunds and open invitations to return for another drive, completely free of charge. Some accepted the refund and left immediately, wanting nothing more than to get away. Others, like me, took the second option, though I suspect most of us, like me, will never actually use it. I spent those last 2 days at the ranch in a daze. They offered activities, riding, helping with livestock, just relaxing, but everything felt hollow. The dream had turned into a nightmare, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd been targeted, hunted. The officials who came to investigate found no evidence of who might have been responsible. The tracks of our horses had obliterated any other evidence. It was ruled an unfortunate accident caused by unknown factors. But I knew. Russell knew. Maybe some of the others knew too. This hadn't been an accident. When I finally flew home, I felt like I was escaping. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares. I'd wake up feeling the ground shake with hooves, hearing the screams. Chip was okay, All our horses had been recovered eventually, but I couldn't bring myself to ride for almost a year afterward. The thing I'd loved most in the world had become tainted by fear. 13 years later, I've processed most of it. I ride again, though never on trail drives, never in wilderness areas. I've made my peace with what happened, though I'll never truly understand it. Jürgen recovered, though he has chronic pain from his injuries. Tom's arm healed with only minor loss of mobility. The others all recovered to various degrees, carrying physical and emotional scars. I still have the flight information for that return trip to Montana, the invitation to come back free of charge. Sometimes I take it out and look at it. Part of me wants to go back, to reclaim something that was taken from me that night. To prove that I'm not afraid, that I won't let someone's cruelty drive me away from something I love. But the truth is, I am afraid. Not of the horses, not even really of the wilderness. I'm afraid of the darkness in people, of the hatred that could drive someone to hurt innocence, just for being somewhere they didn't think we belonged. I'm afraid of what lurks in remote places, not monsters from folklore, but human beings capable of monstrous acts. Montana is still there, wild and beautiful and dangerous. The horses still run free across those plains, living their lives unconcerned with human drama. And somewhere out there, possibly still, are people who view that land as theirs alone, who will do terrible things to keep outsiders away. When people ask me about that trip now, I tell them about the first 2 days, the beauty, the freedom, the exhilaration of working with those magnificent animals. I tell them it was challenging and rewarding, and something everyone should try at least once. I don't tell them about the torn rabbit, about Russell's warnings, about the sound of hooves bearing down in the dark, about the screams and the blood in the aftermath. I don't tell them that paradise can turn to hell in seconds, that the wilderness isn't just beautiful but brutal, that some people don't want you there and will make sure you know it. Those parts of the story stay with me, locked away most days but always there, waiting in the shadows of my memory. And on quiet nights when the wind sounds like galloping hooves or a branch scrapes against the window like fingernails, I remember. And I thank God I survived to remember it all. The invitation to return sits in my desk drawer. I've never thrown it away, but I've never used it either. Maybe someday I will. Maybe someday I'll be brave enough or foolish enough to go back. But not today. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. My name is Len Gable, and even now, nearly a decade later, my hands still shake when I think about what happened in those Pennsylvania woods back in 2015. I've spent years trying to make sense of it, questioning my sanity, wondering if I should share this story, but the nightmares won't stop, and maybe putting it down on paper will help me find some peace. I was 42 then, making a modest living as a carpenter in Pittsburgh's South Side, where I'd built a reputation for detailed craftsmanship in home renovations. My days were filled with the familiar rhythm of measuring, cutting, and building, while my weekends were my escape, time spent at my grandfather's old hunting cabin about 2 hours outside the city, near the Allegheny National Forest. The cabin itself wasn't much to look at. A sturdy 2-bedroom structure with weather-beaten cedar siding and a tin roof that sang in the rain. But it was mine, inherited from my grandfather along with his old Winchester shotgun and a lifetime of memories. I'd spent countless weekends there over the years, fixing loose boards, replacing shingles, and gradually making it more comfortable without losing its rustic charm. The isolation was what I loved most. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and cell service was spotty at best. It was my retreat from the constant noise and demands of city life, a place where I could hear myself think. That particular weekend in late October started like any other. I'd invited my 2 oldest friends, Mitch Yates and Dave Bowser, up for some fishing and relaxation. We'd known each other since our days at Carrick High School, where Mitch had been the class clown and Dave the quiet brainiac who helped us pass algebra. Time had changed us all. Mitch now owned a successful plumbing business, his teenage swagger replaced by a comfortable middle-aged spread, while Dave had settled into a career as an accountant, his premature baldness offset by a meticulously maintained goatee. But when we got together, it was like no time had passed at all. The drive up was filled with the usual banter and catch-up conversation. Mitch complained about his ex-wife's latest demands. Dave talked about his daughter's college applications. And I shared stories about my latest renovation project, a Victorian mansion in Shadyside that was turning into a money pit for its owners. The autumn colors were at their peak, painting the hillsides in brilliant shades of red and gold, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees as we turned onto the gravel road leading to the cabin. The first sign that something was wrong came when we pulled up to the cabin around 6:30 p.m. The temperature had dropped significantly, and our breath formed clouds in the crisp October air as we unloaded our gear from Mitch's F-150. The cabin looked the same as always, but something felt off, a subtle wrongness that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the unusual silence of the woods, or the way the shadows seemed deeper than normal around the building's foundations. I brushed it off as paranoia and focused on getting settled in. We spent that first evening on the cabin's screened-in porch, drinking beer and sharing stories around the old Coleman lantern. Mitch was in rare form, regaling us with increasingly embellished tales of his glory days, including the infamous story of how he'd fallen into Lake Arthur trying to impress a girl at a summer party back in '89. "Oh, come on, Dave," he protested when Dave brought it up. "That was years ago. Besides, she did give me her number." He grinned and took another pull from his beer. "Yeah," Dave shot back. "And then she gave you mono." We laughed, and for a while, everything felt normal and right with the world. The night passed uneventfully, but I had trouble sleeping. The old cabin creaked and settled in ways that seemed unfamiliar, despite my years of staying there. I told myself it was just the changing weather, the wood contracting in the autumn chill, but something about the sounds felt deliberate, almost purposeful. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with shapeless shadows and the sensation of being watched. We were up before dawn the next morning, the cabin filling with the aroma of strong coffee, and the sound of Dave's bacon sizzling in the cast-iron skillet. The early morning light painted everything in soft grays and blues as we gathered our fishing gear and headed out to our favorite spot, a secluded cove about a mile from the cabin where the lake narrowed and deepened, creating the perfect habitat for bass and pike. The fishing was good that morning. Surprisingly good, actually. We caught several decent-sized bass, and even a monster pike that had Mitch cursing and struggling with his rod for a good 15 minutes before he finally landed it. But there was something unusual about the fish. Their colors seemed off somehow, too pale, and their eyes had a milky, almost opaque quality that I'd never seen before. Dave, who'd been fishing these waters as long as I had, noticed it too, but neither of us said anything at the time. Looking back, I wish we had. It was around noon when we decided to head back to the cabin to clean our catch and grab some lunch. The day had warmed up considerably, but the woods felt different on the return trip. The birds had gone quiet, and the usual rustling of small animals in the underbrush was noticeably absent. We were about 100 yards from the cabin when I stopped dead in my tracks. The front door was standing slightly open, swaying gently in the breeze. My stomach dropped. I knew, absolutely knew, that I'd locked that door before we left. It was a habit ingrained by years of cabin ownership, as automatic as breathing. "Guys, did anyone come back to the cabin while we were fishing?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Mitch and Dave exchanged glances, their expressions mirroring the unease I felt. "No way, Len," Mitch replied, his usual jovial tone replaced by something more cautious. "You were the last one out, remember?" We approached the cabin with the caution of men who'd seen enough horror movies to know better but were too stubborn to turn back. Dave had picked up a fallen branch, a poor weapon but better than nothing, while Mitch moved with uncharacteristic silence, his usual swagger replaced by tense alertness. The crunch of leaves under our boots seemed impossibly loud in the stillness of the afternoon. The interior of the cabin was a scene of calculated chaos. This wasn't the random destruction you'd expect from an animal break-in. I'd dealt with those before, usually bears looking for food. No, this was different. Our duffel bags had been unzipped and methodically emptied. The contents spread across the floor as if someone or something had been studying them. The kitchen cabinet stood open, cans and packages examined and discarded. Most disturbing of all, our phones, which we'd left charging on the counter, were arranged in a precise line, screens facing down. "Jesus Christ," Mitch whispered, running a hand through his graying hair. "This isn't kids, Len. Kids trash places, they don't organize things." He was right. There was an unsettling intelligence behind the disarray, a purpose we couldn't understand. Dave moved to check the bedrooms while I examined the doorframe for signs of forced entry. There were none. The lock was intact, undamaged. It was as if whatever had gotten in had simply passed through the solid wood. We spent the next hour putting the cabin back in order, none of us wanting to voice the questions burning in our minds. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows as we worked, and I couldn't shake the feeling that those shadows were watching us, measuring our movements. Our earlier plans for cleaning and cooking the fish were forgotten. None of us had much appetite anyway. As dusk approached, we built a fire in the pit outside, more for comfort than warmth. Nobody wanted to stay in the cabin longer than necessary. We sat close to the flames, our conversation forced and hollow, each of us jumping at every snap of a twig in the surrounding darkness. The woods that had always been my sanctuary now felt alien and hostile. "Maybe we should call the Rangers," Dave suggested, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "Report a break-in." But even as he said it, we all knew we wouldn't. What would we tell them? That someone had broken in without breaking anything, rearranged our belongings with bizarre precision, and vanished without a trace. They'd write it off as drunk campers playing pranks, if they bothered to come out at all. It was around midnight when everything went to hell. The fire had burned low, and we were considering calling it a night when we heard the scream. It came from the direction of the lake, a sound that started human but twisted into something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up and my skin break out in goosebumps. It wasn't the scream of someone being attacked or injured. It was the scream of someone seeing something their mind couldn't process. Before we could react, a figure burst from the tree line into the dying firelight. It was a woman, probably in her early 30s, her hiking clothes torn and muddy. Her eyes were wide with terror, and she was gasping for breath as if she'd been running for miles. "Help me," she managed to choke out before collapsing to her knees. "It's in the water. Oh God, it's in the water." Mitch reached her first, helping her to her feet while Dave and I scanned the darkness beyond the firelight's reach. Her name was Lisa Marshall, she told us between sobs, and she'd been hiking the trail that skirted the lake's eastern shore. She'd stopped to fill her water bottle when she saw it, something moving beneath the surface, something big. At first she thought it was a fish or maybe a beaver, but then it had turned to look at her. That's when we heard it, a wet sliding sound coming from the direction of the lake, accompanied by a deep resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in our bones. The woman's grip on Mitch's arm tightened, and she began to whimper. I ran into the cabin and grabbed my grandfather's Winchester, checking to make sure it was loaded. When I returned, I saw them, eyes reflecting the firelight from the tree line, but not like any animal's eyes I'd ever seen. They were huge, spaced too far apart, and instead of the usual red or green reflection, they shone with a pale corpse-light blue. The creature emerged from the shadows with a fluid grace that defied its size. In the flickering firelight, I could see that its skin was a sickly white, almost translucent, stretched too tight over a frame that seemed to be constantly shifting and changing shape. It moved on too many limbs, long, spindly appendages that bent in impossible ways. But it was the face that haunted my nightmares for years afterward, if you could even call it a face. Where features should have been, there was only a smooth, blank surface, occasionally rippling with suggestions of eyes and mouth, like something trying to remember what a face should look like. Dave moved first, shoving Lisa toward the cabin while yelling for us to run. The creature's response was immediate and terrifying. Its form seemed to elongate, stretching upward until it towered over us, those pale eyes multiplying and splitting like cells under a microscope. I raised the Winchester and fired, the blast deafening in the quiet night. The creature recoiled, a high-pitched keening sound cutting through the air, but it didn't fall. Instead, its skin began to ripple and change, adapting to the injury like flowing water. What followed was chaos. We made it to the cabin, but the creature was fast, impossibly fast. It flowed through the gaps around the door like liquid smoke, reforming inside with us. Mitch swung a chair at it while I reloaded the shotgun, and Dave had somehow found my old hunting knife. Lisa huddled in the corner, her screams mixing with the creature's inhuman shrieks as we fought for our lives in the confined space. The battle in the cabin was like something from a nightmare, made worse by the fact that I was wide awake and coldly, terrifyingly sober. The creature moved with an awful intelligence, cutting off escape routes and herding us into corners. When Dave managed to slash it with the hunting knife, its flesh parted like gelatin and reformed almost instantly. My second shotgun blast caught it in what passed for its chest, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw through the hole in its body to the wall behind it, before the wound closed like ripples in a pond. But the shotgun blast seemed to disorient it, disrupting whatever otherworldly force held its form together. Each time I fired, Its movements became more erratic, its shape less stable. After the third shot, portions of its body began to lose cohesion, dripping like melting wax onto my grandfather's hardwood floor. The wood sizzled where the drops landed, eating into the finish like acid. The killing blow, if you can call it that, came when Mitch, in an act of desperate bravery or complete madness, drove a cast-iron fireplace poker through one of its eyes. The creature's form convulsed violently, its body rippling and contorting in ways that made my mind recoil. A sound like radio static mixed with a dying animal's scream filled the cabin, and then, with a sudden implosion that sucked the air from our lungs, it collapsed in on itself. What remained was a rapidly dissolving mass of translucent tissue that looked like neither flesh nor fabric, neither solid nor liquid. Within minutes it had evaporated completely, leaving only scorch marks on the floor and a sickly sweet odor that reminded me of rotting flowers. We spent the rest of that night huddled together in the cabin's main room, weapons close at hand, jumping at every sound. Lisa told us her story in full. She was an experienced hiker from Erie who had been camping alone near the lake. She'd first noticed something was wrong when all the wildlife seemed to vanish from the area. Then she'd seen it in the water, watching her with those impossible eyes. She'd run for what felt like hours before finding our cabin. As dawn broke, we did our best to clean up the evidence of the night's events. The scorch marks wouldn't come out of the floor, and there were deep gouges in the walls that no normal animal could have made. We buried what little solid matter remained of the creature deep in the woods, marking the spot with a pile of rocks more to warn us away than to commemorate anything. The drive back to Pittsburgh was silent, except for the occasional murmur from Lisa, who we dropped off at her sister's house in Erie. She hugged each of us before she left, and we exchanged numbers with promises to stay in touch. We all knew we'd need someone to talk to about this, someone who wouldn't think we were crazy. The aftermath was harder than I expected. Nightmares were constant at first, dreams of pale flesh and too many eyes, of bodies that moved in ways nothing should move. I couldn't look at large bodies of water without imagining something watching from below. Mitch threw himself into work, taking on more jobs than he could handle, while Dave became obsessed with researching local legends and unexplained phenomena, convinced he could find some explanation for what we'd encountered. I sold the cabin 6 months later to a young couple from Ohio. I didn't tell them anything about what had happened. What could I say? But I did include a letter with the deed, warning them never to fish alone, and to always lock the doors at night. Whether they heeded that warning, I don't know. I've never gone back to check. Lisa called me about a year later. She'd moved to Colorado, as far from large bodies of water as she could get. She was seeing a therapist, she said, trying to work through the trauma. She couldn't tell the whole truth, of course, but just talking about the parts she could share seemed to help. We still exchange Christmas cards, brief messages that say nothing about that night but carry the weight of shared understanding. These days, I stick to home improvement projects in the city. My clients sometimes ask why I don't take jobs out in the country anymore, where the real estate is cheaper and the work more plentiful. I tell them I prefer the convenience of city living, the proximity to supplies and services. What I don't tell them is that I've seen what lives in the quiet places, in the deep waters and dark woods. I've seen what happens when something from outside our understanding of reality takes an interest in human beings. Mitch, Dave, and I still get together occasionally, usually at Dave's house in the suburbs. We drink beer and watch sports, talking about normal things like jobs and families and home repairs. But sometimes late in the evening when the conversation dies down, we catch each other's eyes and know we're all thinking about that night, about the creature, about how fragile our understanding of the world really is. I've never told this story before now. Most people wouldn't believe it anyway, and those who might believe it are probably better off not knowing. But sometimes, when I read about mysterious disappearances in rural areas or unexplained phenomena near isolated lakes and forests, I wonder if that thing in the cabin was unique, or if there are more of them out there, watching and waiting in the dark places of the world. All I know for certain is this: there are things in this world that defy explanation. Things that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear, and sometimes, if we're very lucky, we survive our encounters with them, but we're never quite the same afterward. This is my story, as true as I can tell it. Make of it what you will. But if you're ever in the woods late at night, and the animals go quiet, and you get that feeling of being watched, don't ignore it. Don't tell yourself it's nothing. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because sometimes, The monsters are real. My name is Fletcher Haynes, and back in 2002, I had an experience that changed my life forever. The events I'm about to share have haunted me for over 2 decades, reshaping everything I thought I knew about the world and what lurks in its darkest corners. I was born and raised in Chicago's bustling Wicker Park neighborhood, where the closest thing to wildlife was the occasional raccoon rummaging through garbage bins. My life revolved around computer screens and office buildings. I was a senior software engineer at a prominent tech firm, spending my days debugging code and attending endless meetings. Nature was something I experienced through Discovery Channel documentaries, and I was perfectly content with that arrangement. Then came the divorce, a messy separation that left me questioning everything about my life choices and the direction I was heading. It was during this vulnerable period that my college friends, Nolan Reynolds, Rocco Martinez, and Quinn Thompson, convinced me to join them on what was supposed to be a therapeutic getaway to the Colorado Rockies. Nolan, always the optimist, had found what he described as the perfect spot, a secluded cabin nestled deep in the Pike National Forest, miles away from the nearest town. Just what you need, he insisted, his enthusiasm infectious. No phones, no emails, no lawyers, just 4 guys reconnecting with nature and themselves. Looking back, I wish I'd trusted my initial hesitation. The cabin itself was a testament to rustic charm, a 2-story structure built in the 1950s with weathered cedar siding and a sprawling wraparound porch that offered panoramic views of the surrounding wilderness. The interior was surprisingly well maintained, with modern amenities thoughtfully integrated into the traditional mountain aesthetic. Plush leather couches, a fully equipped kitchen, and 4 comfortable bedrooms upstairs. The living room centerpiece was a massive stone fireplace that reached up to the exposed beam ceiling. The air inside smelled of pine and wood smoke, a striking contrast to the urban pollution I'd grown accustomed to. Those first few days were genuinely therapeutic. We fell into an easy rhythm, spending our mornings hiking the numerous trails that spiderwebbed through the surrounding forest. Afternoons were dedicated to fishing in the nearby stream, where Rocco, despite his city upbringing, proved surprisingly adept at catching rainbow trout. The evenings were filled with laughter around the fireplace or out on the porch, sharing stories and memories from our college days while nursing bottles of craft beer. Nolan, true to form, kept us entertained with his peculiar brand of humor. His infamous quantum mechanics chicken joke, which involved Schrodinger's cat somehow crossing the road in multiple dimensions simultaneously, became a running gag, growing more absurd with each retelling. The transformation from our normal lives was remarkable. Quinn, who normally carried the weight of his investment banking career like a visible burden, seemed years younger. Rocco's usually sharp edges had softened, and even I found myself forgetting about the divorce proceedings waiting for me back in Chicago. But on that 3rd night, everything changed. We were gathered around a campfire, the flames casting dancing shadows on our faces as we roasted marshmallows and shared ghost stories. Harmless fun that would soon turn into something far more sinister. The first indication that something was wrong came as a deep, resonating sound from the darkness beyond our circle of firelight. It wasn't like anything we'd heard in the previous days, not the familiar rustle of deer moving through underbrush, or the occasional hoot of an owl. This was something heavier, more deliberate, as if something massive was methodically making its way through the forest. The conversation died immediately, replaced by an oppressive silence broken only by the crackling of our fire. Nolan, always the de facto leader of our group, grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight, the kind used by search and rescue teams, and swept its beam across the tree line. The light caught nothing but shadows and swaying branches, but the sound had stopped abruptly, as if whatever was out there knew it had been spotted and was now watching us. Rocco attempted to break the tension with a nervous laugh, suggesting it was probably just a deer, or maybe even a moose, but his voice carried an edge of uncertainty that did nothing to ease our collective unease. The incident cast a pall over the rest of the evening, and we retired to the cabin earlier than usual, double-checking the locks on the doors, something we hadn't bothered with before. That night, lying in my bed listening to the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in our wilderness paradise. The forest that had seemed so welcoming just hours before now felt like an alien landscape harboring secrets we weren't meant to discover. The next morning, Quinn and I decided to clear our heads with a hike, while Nolan and Rocco opted for some fishing. The trail we chose led deeper into the forest than we'd ventured before, winding through increasingly dense vegetation. We talked about normal things, work, relationships, future plans, but there was an undercurrent of tension in our conversation, as if we were both trying too hard to act like everything was normal. About an hour into our hike, we stumbled upon something that shattered any remaining pretense of normalcy. In a small clearing, arranged with impossible precision, was a circle of standing stones. Each rock was about waist high, weathered by countless seasons but clearly placed there with purpose. The grass within the circle was different, darker, coarser than the surrounding vegetation. The air felt heavier here, charged with something I couldn't explain. I took several photos with my phone, trying to document what we were seeing while fighting the growing urge to flee. Quinn, usually the most rational among us, suggested we head back, and I agreed without hesitation. The return journey was marked by an increasing sense of being watched. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf seemed amplified, and we found ourselves walking faster, closer together, speaking in whispers without really knowing why. When we finally emerged from the trail near the cabin, we found Nolan and Rocco on the porch, their faces ashen. The symbols carved into the porch wood defied explanation. Angular, primitive shapes that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent in the fading daylight. They were carved deep into the weathered planks, the wood around them splintered and raw, suggesting they had been etched with tremendous force. Nolan, his earlier bravado noticeably diminished, explained how he and Rocco had discovered them after returning from their unsuccessful fishing expedition. "We were only gone for 3 hours," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No one could have gotten up here and done this without us seeing them on the road." The implications of his words hung heavy in the air. That night, we transformed the cozy cabin into a makeshift fortress. We dragged the heavy oak dining table against the front door and wedged chairs under all the doorknobs. The windows, usually left open to catch the mountain breeze, were sealed tight, their latches double and triple checked. We gathered in the living room, armed with an arsenal of improvised weapons, kitchen knives, heavy flashlights, and a rusty axe we'd found in the woodshed. The casual camaraderie of the previous nights was replaced by tense silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin's timber frame and our own nervous breathing. The midnight hour brought with it a profound darkness that seemed to seep through the walls like black ink. The footsteps, when they started, were unmistakable. Heavy, deliberate movements that circled the cabin with predatory patience. We could track the creature's progress by the sound of its weight on the wooden porch and the occasional scrape of what might have been claws against the exterior walls. Then came the thud, a sound so forceful it made the windows rattle in their frames. Quinn, who had been obsessively checking his phone for a signal we all knew wouldn't be there, let out an involuntary gasp. Nolan's decision to confront whatever stalked us outside was both brave and foolish, characteristics that had defined him since our college days. "We can't just sit here waiting," he declared, gripping the heavy flashlight like a club. "We need to know what we're dealing with." None of us wanted to let him go out alone, though whether this was out of loyalty or the primitive instinct not to be separated, I'm still not sure. We moved as a group toward the door, our movements synchronized by fear. The porch boards creaked beneath our feet as we emerged into the oppressive darkness. The night air was unnaturally still, carrying an odor I can only describe as ancient, like disturbing the air in a long-sealed tomb. Our flashlight beams cut through the darkness like solid things, creating more shadows than they dispelled. And there, at the tree line, we saw it, a figure that haunts my nightmares to this day. The creature stood easily 8 feet tall, its body a mass of matted dark fur that seemed to absorb our flashlight beams. But it was the eyes that fixed us in place, reflective like an animal's, yet possessed of an intelligence that was terrifyingly human. Its proportions were all wrong, with arms that hung almost to the ground, ending in hands that were too large, too articulated to belong to any known species. The head was massive, vaguely lupine, but with a slope to the forehead that suggested something closer to human, and when it opened its mouth, the teeth that gleamed in our flashlight beams were clearly designed for tearing flesh. Quinn's shout to retreat barely registered before we were all moving, stumbling over each other in our desperation to get back inside. The sound the creature made, a noise that started as a deep rumble and rose to a pitch that set our teeth on edge, seemed to reverberate through our bones. We slammed the door just as something heavy crashed against it, the impact sending tremors through the entire cabin. That night stretched into an eternity of terror. We took shifts keeping watch, though none of us really slept. The creature would retreat into the darkness only to return without warning, testing different entry points around the cabin. It seemed to be studying us, learning our patterns, waiting for a moment of weakness. The symbols on the porch began to make a terrible kind of sense. They weren't a random act of vandalism, but a message or perhaps a warning of what was to come. By dawn, our nerves were frayed to breaking point. Exhaustion had begun to take its toll, making us jumpy and irrational. When Nolan suggested we try to make a break for the cars while we had daylight, it seemed like a reasonable plan. We spent the morning gathering our courage and what few belongings we couldn't bear to leave behind. The forest was quiet, too quiet, as if the normal wildlife had fled from something they knew to fear. But we never got the chance to execute our escape plan. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the attack we had been dreading finally came. The sound of shattering glass from the kitchen window was like a starter's pistol for a race none of us wanted to run. What followed was chaos, a blur of motion, screams, and desperate struggle. The creature moved with impossible speed for something of its size, its massive form filling the kitchen doorway, as Nolan, brave to the last, confronted it with nothing but a kitchen knife. The scene in the kitchen remains burned into my memory with horrific clarity. Nolan's confrontation with the creature was both heroic and futile. The knife seemed to do little more than enrage it. The beast's claws raked across his chest with devastating force, sending him sprawling across the floor in a spray of blood. The sight of my friend lying there, his shirt rapidly turning crimson, triggered something primal in me. I grabbed the cast iron skillet from the stove, a massive, well-seasoned piece that must have weighed close to 10 pounds, and swung it with every ounce of strength I possessed. The impact reverberated up my arms, accompanied by a shriek that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. The creature staggered backward, more surprised than hurt, its eyes blazing with an intelligence that made the encounter all the more terrifying. Quinn and I seized the moment, grabbing Nolan under his arms and dragging him toward the front door. His breathing was labored, and I could feel the warmth of his blood soaking through my shirt where I supported him. That's when Rocco made his fatal decision. "The keys," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "We need the car keys." Before any of us could stop him, he turned back toward the cabin. I'll never forget the look in his eyes, a mixture of determination and raw fear that suggested he knew, on some level, what was about to happen. He disappeared into the darkness of the cabin, and seconds later his scream pierced the night. It wasn't just a cry of fear or pain, it was the sound of a man facing something beyond his capacity to comprehend, a sound that ended with horrifying abruptness. Quinn and I didn't stop to think. Supporting Nolan between us, we stumbled down the gravel road, our legs burning with effort. Every shadow seemed to hide another monster, every rustle of leaves promising fresh horrors. The moon had disappeared behind thick clouds, leaving us in near total darkness. We were running blind, guided only by the feel of gravel under our feet, and the desperate need to put distance between ourselves and whatever had taken Rocco. Providence, or perhaps simple luck, led us to another cabin. Through the trees we saw the warm glow of electric lights, a beacon of civilization in our nightmare. The occupants, an elderly couple named the Hendersons, responded to our frantic pounding with remarkable calm. Perhaps they'd seen similar things in their years in the mountains, though they never said as much. Mrs. Henderson, a former nurse, immediately began tending to Nolan's wounds while her husband called for emergency services. The wait for help was excruciating. Every sound from the forest made us jump, and I kept expecting to see those reflective eyes peering through the windows. But whatever had attacked us seemed unwilling or unable to approach this cabin. When the ambulance finally arrived, its red lights painting the trees in surreal patterns, I felt a relief so profound it left me weak-kneed. The aftermath was almost as difficult as the encounter itself. The authorities conducted a search, of course. They found the cabin exactly as we described. Broken window, scratched symbols, signs of struggle, but no trace of Rocco or the creature. They attributed the attack to a bear, perhaps rabid or protecting its territory. The symbols were dismissed as vandalism, probably done by previous guests. It was easier for them to force our experience into familiar categories than to confront the possibility of something unknown. Nolan's physical recovery was remarkable. The doctors said he was lucky, that the cuts had somehow missed anything vital. But the psychological scars ran deeper. He withdrew from society, moving to a small apartment in downtown Denver, where he was surrounded by concrete and steel. Quinn threw himself into research, becoming obsessed with finding an explanation for what we'd encountered. He spent countless hours in libraries and online forums, searching for similar incidents. It was Quinn who eventually found the Native American legends about the Shadow Walker. According to the stories passed down through generations of the Ute tribe, it was a guardian spirit that protected sacred places from those who would despoil them. The description matched what we'd seen. A massive upright figure with long arms and ancient eyes. The symbols we'd found carved into the porch were said to be warnings, marking the territory of something that had existed in those mountains long before humans arrived. The research provided a framework for understanding our experience, but it didn't bring closure. Rocco's family never gave up hope of finding him, but as the months turned into years, the searches became less frequent. The posters faded, and life moved on for everyone except those of us who knew the truth. I've never been able to settle down since that night. I move frequently, always drawn to urban areas where the only predators are human ones. I've tried therapy, medication, even hypnosis, but nothing can fully erase the memory of those reflective eyes and that terrible scream. Sometimes, late at night when sleep won't come, I find myself wondering about Rocco. Did he die quickly, or is he out there somewhere, changed by whatever encountered him in that cabin? The forest holds its secrets closely, and some questions are better left unanswered. The cabin still stands. I've checked online occasionally. It's been renovated and is back on the rental market, its dark history carefully omitted from the listing. I wonder about the people who stay there, if they feel something watching them from the trees, if they notice the ancient symbols carved into the porch. I've learned to live with the knowledge that our world is stranger and more dangerous than most people imagine. The comfortable illusions of civilization, our belief that we've tamed the wild places and cataloged all their inhabitants, seem naive to me now. There are things in this world that defy our understanding. Creatures that remember when humans were not the apex predators we imagine ourselves to be. For those who might find themselves in similar situations, I offer this advice: trust your instincts. That prickle on the back of your neck, that feeling of being watched, the sudden silence in the woods, these are warnings written into our DNA by countless generations of ancestors who learned the hard way that humans don't belong everywhere. Some places should remain wild, some territories unmarked, some creatures left to their ancient domains. As for me, I've found a measure of peace in sharing my story. Not everyone believes it, of course, but those who have had their own encounters understand. We form a kind of unofficial support group, sharing our experiences in hushed voices over coffee or late-night phone calls. It helps to know we're not alone, that others have glimpsed behind the veil of ordinary reality and lived to tell about it. I still have the pictures I took of the stone circle on my phone, though they've never come out clearly, just blurred images that could be anything. Perhaps that's for the best. Some truths are too heavy for evidence, too profound for proof. They can only be carried in memory, passed on in stories, whispered as warnings to those who might venture too far from the safety of their known world. The Shadow Walker, as we've come to call it, remains out there, guarding its territory with ancient patience. And somewhere in the mountains of Colorado, a circle of stones stands in a clearing, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting visitors to stumble upon its secrets. This happened in the summer of 1984. I had just turned 28, and life seemed full of possibility. My name is Timothy O'Shaughnessy, and this is the story of how a simple hiking trip turned into a nightmare that would haunt me for decades to come. I had always been drawn to nature, even as a kid growing up in the suburbs of Portland. My parents would take me camping in the Cascades during summer breaks, and those trips kindled a lifelong love affair with the great outdoors. As I got older, my adventures became more ambitious. By my mid-20s, I was tackling multi-day backpacking trips and scaling some of Oregon's most challenging peaks. Flagstaff, Arizona became my home after college. The high desert landscape was a far cry from the lush forests of the Pacific Northwest, but it had its own rugged beauty. I worked as a geologist for a small environmental consulting firm, a job that often took me into the field. Whether I was collecting soil samples or mapping rock formations, I relished any excuse to be outside. It was during one of these work trips that I met Orson Caldwell. We were both attending a conference on groundwater contamination in Phoenix, and we bonded over our shared love of the outdoors. Orson was a hydrologist from Tucson, with a wiry build and a wild mop of graying hair that made him look older than his 40 years. He had a quick wit, and a penchant for terrible puns that never failed to make me groan. Over the next few years, Orson and I stayed in touch, occasionally meeting up for hiking trips in various parts of Arizona. We made a good team. I was the more experienced climber, while Orson had an encyclopedic knowledge of local flora and fauna. Our trips were always a mix of physical challenge and impromptu nature lessons. In the spring of '84, Orson called me with an exciting proposition. He had recently learned about a little-known trail in the Tonto National Forest, one that wasn't on any official maps. According to a friend of a friend, it led to a hidden canyon with some of the most spectacular rock formations in the state. "It'll be an adventure, Timmy boy," Orson exclaimed over the phone, his enthusiasm infectious. "Just think, we might be some of the first people to see this place in years." I was intrigued, but also a bit skeptical. "Are you sure this trail actually exists?" "Sounds a bit too good to be true." Orson laughed. "Where's your sense of adventure? Besides, I've got rough directions. It'll be like a treasure hunt." I couldn't resist the allure of exploring uncharted territory. We made plans to meet up in 2 weeks on the first weekend of June. Little did I know that this decision would change the course of my life forever. The 2 weeks leading up to our trip passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. I pored over topographic maps of the area, trying to pinpoint the location of this mysterious canyon based on Orson's vague directions. I also took inventory of my gear, replacing worn items and stocking up on essentials. As the departure date drew near, a strange sense of unease began to gnaw at me. I chalked it up to pre-trip jitters. But looking back, I wonder if it was some kind of subconscious warning. The night before I left Flagstaff, I had a vivid nightmare that left me shaken. In the dream, I was wandering through a dark forest. The trees seemed to whisper as I passed, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I came to a clearing where a massive, twisted tree stood. Its trunk was split open, revealing a pulsing, sickly green light. As I approached, I saw movement inside the trunk, something large and inhuman. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. I almost called Orson to cancel, but I knew he'd just laugh it off. Besides, I told myself it was just a stupid dream. I'd been watching too many late-night horror movies. Still, as I loaded up my Jeep and headed south towards our meeting point, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Orson and I rendezvoused at a small diner in Globe, a former mining town about 90 miles southeast of Phoenix. He was already there when I arrived, nursing a cup of coffee and poring over a hand-drawn map. "Timmy," he exclaimed as I slid into the booth across from him. "Ready for the adventure of a lifetime?" I forced a smile, pushing away my lingering unease. "As ready as I'll ever be. Let's see this map of yours." Orson spread out the crude map on the table. It was hand-drawn on a piece of graph paper, with vague landmarks and distances scrawled in nearly illegible handwriting. The trail we were looking for wasn't marked, but Orson pointed to a blank area between two ridgelines. "It should be right around here," he said confidently. "My buddy swears there's a cairn marking the trailhead, just off the main forest road." I studied the map skeptically. "This isn't much to go on, Orson. Are you sure about this?" He waved away my concerns. "Where's the fun if we know exactly where we're going? Trust me, it'll be worth it when we find that canyon." We spent the next hour going over our gear and supplies. We were planning for a 3-day trip. 1 day to hike in, 1 to explore the canyon, and 1 to hike out. We had enough food and water for 5 days, just to be safe, plus the usual camping gear and first aid supplies. As we finished our preparations, the waitress came by to refill our coffee. She was an older woman with kind eyes and a weathered face that spoke of a lifetime in the harsh Arizona sun. "You boys heading out into the forest?" she asked, eyeing our gear. "Yes, ma'am," Orson replied cheerfully. "Just a little weekend expedition." The waitress frowned slightly. "Be careful out there. There's been some strange things happening in those woods lately." My ears perked up. "What kind of strange things?" She lowered her voice. "People gone missing. Hikers finding things that don't belong. Noises in the night that don't sound like any animal that should be out there." Orson laughed nervously. "Sounds like local legends to me. Nothing to worry about, right, Timmy?" I nodded, but the waitress's words had rekindled my earlier unease. As we paid our bill and headed out to our vehicles, I couldn't help but wonder what we were really getting ourselves into. We left the diner and followed the winding forest road deep into the Tonto National Forest. The landscape changed dramatically as we climbed in elevation, the desert scrub giving way to dense pine forests. The air grew cooler and heavy with the scent of sap and decaying leaves. After about an hour of driving, we reached the general area where the trailhead was supposed to be. We parked our vehicles in a small turnout and began searching for the cairn that would mark the start of our journey. It took nearly an hour of combing the area before Orson let out a triumphant shout. "Found it!" I made my way over to where he was standing. Sure enough, there was a small pile of rocks just off the road, partially hidden by a scrub oak. It didn't look like much, but it was the only sign we'd seen that matched the description. We shouldered our packs and set off into the forest. The trail was little more than a faint game path, barely visible in places. We had to rely on Orson's map and our own sense of direction to stay on course. The forest here felt different from other parts of Tonto I'd hiked before. The trees seemed older, their trunks gnarled and twisted into strange shapes. The underbrush was thick and tangled, often forcing us to bushwhack our way through. An oppressive silence hung over everything, broken only by the crunch of our boots and the occasional call of a distant bird. As we hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I turned to look behind us, I half expected to see something lurking in the shadows, but there was never anything there. At least, nothing I could see. Orson seemed oblivious to my growing unease. He chattered away excitedly about the rock formations we might find in the canyon, pausing occasionally to point out interesting plants or animal tracks. We made camp that night in a small clearing. As I set up my tent, I noticed strange markings on some of the surrounding trees. They looked like claw marks, but they were too high up and too wide set to have been made by any animal I was familiar with. "Hey, Orson," I called out. "Come take a look at this." He ambled over, peering at the marks I was pointing to. "Huh, bear, maybe? Or mountain lion?" I shook my head. Too big for either of those. "And look how deep they are. Whatever made these was powerful." Orson frowned, then shrugged. "Probably just some trees that got scraped up in a storm. Nothing to worry about." But I could tell he was unsettled too. We ate our dinner in relative silence that night, the cheerful mood of the morning replaced by a tense vigilance. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with sounds. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But underneath it all was a deeper sound, almost too low to hear, a sort of thrumming vibration that I felt more than heard, like the pulse of some vast sleeping creature. I lay awake for hours that night, straining my ears for any sign of danger. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with shadowy figures, and those strange twisted trees. We broke camp early the next morning, eager to reach the canyon. According to Orson's map, we should reach it by midday if we kept a good pace. The forest seemed different in the pale morning light, less menacing, but no less strange. The gnarled trees cast long shadows across our path, and more than once I caught myself jumping at nothing more than a branch swaying in the breeze. As we hiked, the terrain became increasingly rugged. We found ourselves scrambling over massive boulders and skirting the edges of steep ravines. The vegetation changed too, becoming sparser and more twisted. Some of the plants looked almost alien, ferns with leaves that seemed to writhe when you weren't looking directly at them, flowers with too many petals arranged in impossible geometries. It was nearing noon when we heard the sound of running water. We pushed through a dense thicket and suddenly found ourselves on the edge of a vast canyon. The view took my breath away. Sheer cliffs of red and orange rock plunged hundreds of feet to a ribbon of water far below. Bizarre rock formations dotted the landscape, spiraling columns, precarious arches, and shapes that seemed to defy the laws of physics. But it wasn't just the natural beauty that caught my attention. There was something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The rocks were covered in carvings. Hundreds, maybe thousands of them. They didn't look like any Native American petroglyphs I'd ever seen. The symbols were angular and alien, almost painful to look at directly, and they seemed to move when viewed from the corner of my eye, shifting and rearranging themselves in impossible ways. "Orson," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "are you seeing this?" He nodded slowly, his face pale. "What? What are they?" I shook my head. "I don't know, but I've got a bad feeling about this place. We should have turned back then." Every instinct was screaming at me to get as far away from that canyon as possible, but curiosity and stubbornness won out. We decided to make our way down to the canyon floor to get a closer look at the carvings. The descent was treacherous. The path, if you could call it that, was little more than a series of narrow ledges and steep scree slopes. More than once, I nearly lost my footing and went tumbling into the abyss. As we neared the bottom, the thrumming I'd felt the night before returned, stronger now. It seemed to be coming from the very rock itself, a deep primal rhythm that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. We were about halfway down when Orson suddenly let out a strangled cry. I turned to see him pointing at something on a nearby ledge. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It looked like a tangle of bleached driftwood, oddly out of place in this arid landscape. But as my eyes focused, I realized with growing horror what it really was. Bones. Human bones, twisted and fused together in impossible ways. Skulls with too many eye sockets, rib cages that spiraled like seashells, femurs bent into perfect right angles, and among the bones, glinting in the harsh sunlight, were scraps of modern clothing and the remains of camping gear. I stumbled backward, my stomach heaving. Orson was frozen in place, his eyes wide with terror. "We need to get out of here," I managed to choke out. "Now." But before we could move, a sound echoed through the canyon. A sound that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was like a scream, but no human throat could have produced it. It started low and guttural, then rose to a piercing shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The very air around us seemed to vibrate with its intensity. And then, from the shadows of a nearby crevice, something began to emerge. What happened next is difficult for me to describe, even after all these years. My mind rebels against the memory, trying to rationalize it into something comprehensible. But there was nothing rational about what we saw that day. The thing that emerged from the crevice defied categorization. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but that's where any resemblance to humanity ended. Its body seemed to be in a constant state of flux, shifting and reforming like smoke given solid form. Limbs appeared and disappeared at random, and what I think was its head housed a cluster of writhing tentacles where a face should have been. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. Not the small, beady eyes that blinked in and out of existence across its ever-changing form, but the large, intelligent eyes that regarded us with unmistakable malevolence. They were a deep, swirling green, like pools of toxic waste, and they held an ancient, alien intelligence that made me feel small and insignificant. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stood frozen, locked in a silent standoff with this impossible creature. Then Orson broke the spell with a terrified whimper, and all hell broke loose. The creature let out another of those bone-chilling screams and lunged towards us with impossible speed. I grabbed Orson's arm and yanked him backwards, nearly sending us both tumbling off the narrow ledge. "Run," I yelled, my voice cracking with fear. We scrambled back up the path we had come down, slipping and sliding on the loose scree. The creature pursued us, moving in a way that defied physics. It flowed over the rocks like liquid, then suddenly solidified to leap impossible distances. All the while, it emitted a cacophony of sounds, screeches, growls, and things I can only describe as the auditory equivalent of static. I lost all sense of time and direction as we fled. My world narrowed to the path in front of me, and the terrifying presence behind us. Orson was gasping for breath beside me, his face a mask of terror. We burst out of the canyon and back into the forest, but the nightmare was far from over. The trees themselves seemed to have come alive, their branches reaching out to snag our clothing and hair. The ground beneath our feet writhed and buckled, making every step a challenge. I don't know how long we ran. It could have been minutes or hours. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but the fear of what was behind us kept us going long past the point of exhaustion. Finally, mercifully, we broke through the tree line and found ourselves back at the forest road where we had parked. Our vehicles sat there, dusty and innocuous, like relics from another world. We didn't hesitate. We dove into our respective vehicles and peeled out onto the road, gravel spraying behind us. In my rearview mirror, I caught a final glimpse of the forest. For a moment, I thought I saw a dark shape at the edge of the trees, those toxic green eyes glaring balefully. Then we rounded a bend, and it was gone. The drive back to Globe passed in a blur. Neither of us spoke. We were too shell-shocked to put our experience into words. We parted ways at the same diner where we had started our trip, exchanging only a brief, haunted look before going our separate ways. The days and weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I was plagued by nightmares, reliving the terror of that day over and over. During my waking hours, I jumped at every shadow, convinced that the creature had somehow followed me back to civilization. I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe we had stumbled upon some kind of secret government experiment, or perhaps we had accidentally ingested some hallucinogenic plant and shared a vivid hallucination. But deep down, I knew the truth. What we had encountered was something beyond human understanding, something that shouldn't exist in our reality. I became obsessed with finding answers. I spent countless hours researching cryptozoology, fringe science, and occult lore. I pored over old maps of the Tonto National Forest, trying to pinpoint the exact location of that cursed canyon. But it was as if the place had vanished entirely. None of the maps showed anything resembling what we had seen. My work suffered. I found it hard to concentrate on mundane geological surveys when I knew there were such impossible things lurking in the wilderness. My colleagues noticed the change in me, the dark circles under my eyes, the way I would sometimes zone out in the middle of conversations, lost in the memory of that day. I tried to contact Orson several times in those first few months, but he never returned my calls. Eventually, I heard through mutual acquaintances that he had quit his job and moved away, leaving no forwarding address. Part of me was relieved. I didn't know if I could face him again, to see the same haunted look in his eyes that I saw every time I looked in the mirror. As the months turned into years, the intensity of the memories began to fade. The nightmares became less frequent, though they never went away entirely. I was able to return to some semblance of a normal life, but I was forever changed. I never went hiking or camping again. The wilderness, once a source of joy and renewal, now held only terror for me. But the questions remained, gnawing at the edges of my mind. What was that creature? Where did it come from? And most chillingly, were there more of them out there? It was nearly 5 years after that fateful trip when the letter arrived. It was postmarked from a small town in New Mexico, with no return address. I recognized Orson's handwriting immediately, though it was shakier than I remembered. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and began to read. Dear Timothy, I hope this letter finds you well. Though I doubt either of us has truly been well since that day in the canyon. I'm sorry for cutting off contact. I couldn't face it. Couldn't face you and the memories you represented. But I can't run from it anymore. Things are happening, Timothy. Strange things. I've been hearing stories, whispers of other encounters like ours. Not just in Arizona, but all over the Southwest. People disappearing in the wilderness, only to return changed, if they return at all. Sightings of creatures that shouldn't exist. I've been tracking these stories, trying to find patterns, and I think I'm onto something big. Something that goes beyond just that one creature we saw. This is bigger than we could have imagined, Timothy. I need your help. I know it's asking a lot, but you're the only one who can understand. The only one who knows the truth of what we saw that day. If you're willing, meet me at the coordinates enclosed with this letter on July 15th. Come alone and tell no one where you're going. I know how paranoid this sounds, but trust me, it's necessary. I hope to see you soon, old friend. We have work to do. Orson. I sat there for a long time after reading the letter, my mind a whirl of conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to burn the letter and pretend I'd never received it, to continue with the life I'd rebuilt, safe in the illusion of normalcy. But a larger part of me knew that I would go. The questions that had haunted me for 5 years demanded answers. And if what Orson said was true, if there were more of these things out there, didn't we have a responsibility to do something about it? With a heavy heart and a sense of grim determination, I began to plan for another journey into the unknown. The coordinates Orson provided led me to a remote cabin in the Gila National Forest of New Mexico. As I pulled up the rutted dirt road, my heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread, I saw a familiar figure standing on the porch. Orson had aged far more than the 5 years since I'd last seen him would account for. His hair had gone completely gray, and deep lines etched his face. But his eyes were bright and feverish with the intensity I remembered. Timothy, he said as I got out of my car. You came. I wasn't sure you would. I nodded, suddenly at a loss for words. What do you say to someone after 5 years of silence? especially when your last shared experience was something so traumatic. Orson ushered me into the cabin. The interior was cluttered with papers, maps, and books. One entire wall was covered in a massive corkboard, crisscrossed with red string, connecting photos, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. "What is all this?" I asked, gesturing to the wall. Orson's eyes gleamed. "Evidence, Timothy. Proof that what we saw wasn't an isolated incident. Look here." He pointed to a cluster of photographs. They were blurry and indistinct, but I could make out shapes that sent a chill down my spine, twisted forms that defied natural law, captured in grainy snapshots and shaky video stills. "These have been taken all over the Southwest," Orson explained. "Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, always in remote areas, always near sites of geological oddity, canyons, caves, areas of high mineral concentration." I studied the wall, my scientific mind trying to make sense of the patterns Orson had laid out. "What does it mean?" I asked. Orson took a deep breath. I think these creatures aren't from our world, Timothy. I think they're breaking through from somewhere else. The canyons, the caves, they're weak points, places where the barrier between realities is thin." It sounded crazy, but after what we had seen, could I really discount anything? "There's more," Orson continued. He pulled out a thick file folder and handed it to me. "Missing persons reports. Hundreds of them, all from the same general areas as the sightings. But look at this." He flipped to a section near the back. My blood ran cold as I recognized the faces staring back at me from the photographs. They were people I had seen in the news. People who had been found after going missing in the wilderness. But they were changed. Their eyes held the same haunted look I saw in the mirror every day, and there was something off about their features. As if they weren't quite human anymore. "What happened to them?" I whispered. Orson's voice was grim. "I don't know. But I think they encountered something out there. Something that changed them." We spent the next several hours going over Orson's research. The more I saw, the more convinced I became that he was onto something real and terrifying. The world I thought I knew was just a thin veneer over something much stranger and more dangerous. As night fell, Orson laid out his plan. He believed he had located another weak point. A place where we might be able to observe one of these entities without putting ourselves in immediate danger. He wanted to set up cameras, gather concrete evidence that we could take to the authorities. It was risky, insane even. But I found myself agreeing. We had stumbled onto something huge, something that threatened the very fabric of reality as we understood it. We couldn't just ignore it. As we made our preparations for the expedition, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were stepping off the edge of a cliff into an abyss of unknown depth. But there was no turning back now. Whatever lay ahead, we would face it together. The next morning we set out at dawn. Orson's truck was loaded with camping gear, scientific equipment, and enough cameras to document a small war. We drove for hours, leaving the main roads behind and venturing deep into the New Mexico wilderness. Our destination was a remote mesa, one that didn't appear on any official maps. As we approached, I began to feel the same sense of wrongness that had permeated the air in that Arizona canyon 5 years ago. The landscape seemed to shimmer and shift at the edges of my vision, and that low thrumming vibration I remembered so well began to pulse through the air. We made camp about a mile from the mesa's base, not wanting to get too close until we had a chance to survey the area. As we set up our equipment, I noticed strange patterns in the rocks around us. They looked almost like the carvings we had seen in the canyon, but more subtle, as if they had been worn down by millennia of wind and rain. As night fell, the feeling of otherworldliness intensified. The stars overhead seemed too bright, too close, and they appeared to move in ways that defied astronomical logic. The air itself felt thick and heavy, as if we were breathing something more substantial than mere oxygen. We took turns keeping watch, our cameras trained on the mesa. For hours nothing happened. Then, just as I was about to suggest we call it a night, Orson grabbed my arm. "Look," he whispered, pointing towards the mesa's summit. At first I saw nothing. Then slowly a shape began to coalesce out of the darkness. It was similar to the creature we had encountered in Arizona, but different too. This one was larger, its form more stable, though still in a constant state of flux. It moved with a terrible grace, flowing across the rocky terrain like liquid shadow. Our cameras whirred and clicked, capturing image after image. I prayed that at least some of them would turn out, that we would finally have concrete proof of what we were seeing. But then things took a turn for the worse. The creature suddenly stopped its meandering path and turned in our direction. Even from this distance, I could feel the weight of its gaze. It knew we were there. "We need to go," I said, my voice tight with fear. "Now." Orson nodded, his face pale in the starlight. We began to hastily pack up our gear, but we weren't fast enough. A scream rent the air, that same terrible reality-warping sound I remembered from 5 years ago. The creature was coming for us. We abandoned most of our equipment, grabbing only the cameras and our most essential gear before making a run for the truck. Behind us, I could hear the sound of rock shattering and trees splintering as the creature gave chase. We reached the truck and peeled out onto the rough dirt road, the vehicle bouncing and shuddering under us. In the rearview mirror, I caught glimpses of a massive writhing shape pursuing us, moving far faster than anything that size should be able to. Orson drove like a man possessed, taking turns at breakneck speeds and bouncing over rocks that threatened to tear out the truck's undercarriage. All the while, that unearthly scream echoed behind us, sometimes fading, sometimes growing terrifyingly close. I don't know how long we drove. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, the sounds of pursuit faded away. We had escaped. For now. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town, a small farming community that looked like it hadn't changed much since the 1950s. We pulled into a dusty motel parking lot, both of us shaking with exhaustion and residual terror. "What do we do now?" I asked as we sat there, the engine ticking as it cooled. Orson turned to me, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and determination. "We get this evidence out there. We make people believe. Because if we don't, Timothy, if we don't, I fear for the future of our world." As I nodded in agreement, I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal was far from over. We had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back. And now, for better or worse, we were part of something much larger and more terrifying than we could have ever imagined. The sun rose over the small town, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. It was a beautiful sight, a reminder of the normal world we were fighting to protect. But I knew that I would never be able to look at a sunrise the same way again. Not now that I knew what lurked in the shadows between realities, waiting for its chance to break through. Our fight was just beginning, and the fate of our world might very well hang in the balance.